Greetings, ladies and gents. Good to hear from you all again. It's your man Akil again, and as is unfortunately so often the case, this is one of those situations where a sad occasion, although God knows it could have been a lot sadder, is the catalyst for one of my YouTube videos. Unsurprisingly, this time I am commenting on the shooting that occurred in my old stomping ground of Alexandria, Virginia, in which Republican Congressman from Louisiana, Steve Scalise, was injured in a shooting that apparently was targeted at him and his fellow Republicans while playing a baseball game. That really brings to my mind a lot of the points that I'm always making about the importance of, while disagreeing vigorously with those who oppose our political views, nonetheless recognizing that we needn't be enemies, recognizing our common humanity and our common interests, whether it's based on national kinship or any other commonality, and ultimately just recognizing when one's opponents are not crazy or stupid or evil or any combination of the three. That's a point that I'm always trying to make, maybe not always, but pretty often trying to make in my commentary. Unfortunately, all too often, the point seems to be lost. So I wanted to get a couple of my acquaintances in this afternoon to discuss that whole issue and where they think the quality of political discourse in American society has been going and is likely to go after this shooting. So let me introduce my friend Jason Russell. That's at the bottom of your screen. Jason, say hello.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason Russell. I'm the contributors editor at the Washington Examiner, where I edit op-eds and contributors. So I am very much involved with the public discourse in terms of making sure that what gets out there is high quality.
And in the top left corner of your screen, we have my friend Charles Boyd. Charles?
I recently got my MA, and then I got a certificate in heritage preservation, so I'm very much a history guy, but I'm also a politics guy, and I think the two blend together a lot.
To begin, it couldn't hurt for you guys to just share a little bit about your own experiences having conversations with people across the political spectrum. And Jason, I'd love to get some commentary from you to begin, since your job involves dealing with political discourse all day, every day.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I see most often is crap on Twitter, right? Like people just saying things that you would not believe, things that they would obviously never say in front of a normal person if they were, together in person to their face, right? It's just despicable things, runs the whole gamut from just being generally insulting to, things that are racist, things that are, discriminatory, just all kinds of stuff like that. That's generally the extreme. Again, it's kind of one benefit that it's things that people wouldn't say in front of each other. Generally, these are things that people are not, having as part of serious discussions when they're trying to persuade their friends, generally, not always. And generally what you see on Twitter is not what someone is saying to their friends and family when it comes to actual political discussions, when they're actually trying to persuade each other. So yes, there is a lot of crap on the internet and it's terrible, but you have to remember that those are just extreme examples of the worst of society, and that's not the new normal or anything like that.
That's right. And sometimes even those very same people might show a completely different side of themselves to those with whom they do interact face to face. And, for some reason, I imagine there's probably some scholarly literature out there on this subject already, but I have yet to see any of it myself. Whatever the reason is, the internet just seems to bring out the worst in people when it comes to social discourse. People who are normally very level-headed when you talk to them face to face, they just go completely off the deep end when they're typing messages at people from behind their computer screens. I've seen that in my own experience personally. It's a distressing phenomenon, but I think it is important, like you say, Jason, to put the whole phenomenon in perspective and not overstate its importance. Charles, how about you? I mean, in what exact contexts do you tend to end up either butting heads with people over politics yourself, or even just observing other people butting heads over politics?
Good question. I've been on both, or really all three ends. I've observed it with other people. I've been on the receiving end of it. And I've also made some statements that I thought were reasonable, but have been labeled uncivil by other people. I don't want to dwell on this too much because you guys summed it up really well, but you're absolutely right about the internet. Couldn't agree more. That's a really good point. And I think also radio shows have some similar issues because, again, you're not standing face to face with a person. So I generally try very hard to assume the best motivations with people that I disagree with and try to be as respectful as possible. The one exception is that I really don't have a lot of patience when people make statements that appear to be blatantly bigoted. And that's when my behavior gets a little bit more heated, and I have said some things that I probably, in fact, I definitely would not normally say in a debate about, for example, gun control or the ACA or abortion or anything like that. One example was back when I was in college, there was a speaker who was expressing some viewpoints that I thought were bigoted, and I didn't call him a bigot. I've called people bigots on my blog. I generally, if I'm in a face-to-face conversation with somebody, I guess this goes back to the internet thing. If I'm in a face-to-face conversation with somebody, I'm generally not going to call them a bigot. But I said that I felt that the stance he had expressed was an inherently bigoted stance.
Right. Attack the idea, not the person.
Absolutely, yeah. And I did have a friend of mine who agreed with the policy position that I had, but, was saying, I thought you were disrespectful to him. And I was kind of like, okay, whatever. I think it's partly because my views are pretty heterogeneous. I don't tend to go on a very neat left or right continuum. And so, I've had people call me a loon before, actually, because I thought that it was a mistake to go off the gold standard. I had somebody tell me to F off and die over an article I wrote about Rand Paul a few years ago. So I've been on the receiving end of that. And I've also just seen, there's a lot of Facebook debates that I don't really get into, but I've seen people do it. There was one case where I saw a professor actually call a student a name in a Facebook debate over gun control, which I thought, I would generally not be in favor of anyone doing that. But I think with the power dynamic, that's especially inappropriate. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Really? So wait, was this a professor talking to his or her own student?
It was a student at the same school that he never had classes with.
Okay. Even that's still bad enough, though. So, yeah, I totally hear where you're coming from on that. And as for Facebook debates, I am the master of Facebook debates. I've actually had friends and family talk to me in the past and say, wow, Akil, I saw you have that massive Facebook argument the other day. And I was like, whoa, you saw that? These are people who were not involved in these debates at all. They didn't comment on them. They didn't like any of the comments or statuses involved. They didn't know any of the people with whom I was arguing. And yet they still saw me just doing battle with these sometimes complete strangers on Facebook. And I was like, whoa, I didn't realize it was popping up on the newsfeed and you actually noticed it. But on the other hand, I would like to think that I'm able to reach out to at least some people and win them over to some extent with all this running of my mouth that I do online. So in a way, it's actually heartening to know that there are some folks tuning in. So a burning question a lot of folks watching this might have is, do you guys think there's any legitimate reason to blame folks on the left in general for their political rhetoric, particularly since Trump first started running for president, for the shooting? Do you think, given the political views of the shooter, any responsibility, moral responsibility, if not legal responsibility, lies with left-wing political rhetoric? Let's start with you, Jason, since you work at the Examiner.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, I agree with the left all the time, right? I lean center right, pretty libertarian, but generally lean center right. But, the whole obstruct, resist thing, it's kind of a jump to go from let's obstruct, the Republican agenda and let's resist President Trump to, okay, well, I'm going to go shoot Steve Scalise. That's a totally different thing. Bernie Sanders, he said this was a morally contemptible thing that happened and he totally condemned it. And that's great. I don't think there's anything there that holds them responsible for that. And I would hope that they would have the same standard and responsibility when stuff goes the other way too. You can't hold the left and the right responsible for the craziest members of their coalitions.
And you, Charles?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm generally not a supporter of holding other people's rhetoric responsible for shootings. I think, and this kind of goes back to kind of the bigotry exception I make, I think if somebody is legitimately promoting bigotry, then I think they do bear some moral responsibility for example, hate crimes, but that's not really what we saw here. Somebody who really is very opposed to the right, who is, as we know, a lone wolf, basically went on a shooting spree. And I think we can't blame the left if other people make a massive leap and go on a shooting spree. And I think what we also really have to look at is that heated political rhetoric has been going on really since the beginning of our country's history. It even goes back to the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. And so the left is not unique or revolutionary in terms of offering very heated rhetoric. And I would also suggest, with regard to the rise of Donald Trump, I'm a big believer that if you talk to people in a certain tone, that you have to be okay if other people talk back to you in that tone. And the thing with Trump is that he acts so abrasively that I think it's pretty much a logical reaction. I'm not saying that I would or wouldn't do it, but I think it's a logical reaction that other people who dislike Trump are going to respond in a similarly abrasive manner to him.
I agree. I remember in one of the Republican primary debates I think it was in October 2015 on CNBC, one of the moderators asked Donald Trump, he basically ran down a list of all of Trump's shenanigans up to that point, and he said, let's be honest, is this a comic book campaign that you're running? And Trump prefaced his answer by saying, it's not a very nice question that you asked there. And I remember thinking, who the hell are you to complain about anyone not being nice to you after all the diarrhea that you constantly spew at anyone who dares disagree with you or criticize you to any degree? I'm a big believer in reciprocity in human relationships in general. So if you're going to treat people a certain way, you have no right to complain if they treat you the same way in return. I believe in civility in political and public discourse in general, but I think there are exceptions. And I think the main exception, the most obvious exception, is if someone gets uncivil with you without provocation for no good reason, I think you have a certain right to respond in kind, to clap back, as I like to put it. And I'm a big fan of clapping back. If you've ever seen any of my Facebook arguments where they get especially contentious and people start talking ad hominem trash, I can spit it back at them with the best of them, and I make no apologies for it. But then with the folks, the majority of people who are quite civil and respectful, I'm equally civil and respectful in return. So you'll find that people who haven't seen like the broad cross-section of my commentary or my interactions with others, they might be surprised if they see some of the things that I'll say in a minority of cases because they haven't seen that side of me come out. But that's because they don't bring out that side of me because they keep it respectful, you know? I think those are some pretty important rules for people to keep in mind. And I agree with you guys as well when it comes to not holding an entire political movement responsible for the acts of a few extremists or nut jobs in their midst. You know, I believe in personal responsibility more than that, and I think it's important to apply a really rigorous analysis to the question of causation. So, for example, can you honestly say that, say, Bernie Sanders' rhetoric really caused last week's shooter to commit that atrocity? I don't think you can convincingly make that case. I suppose the next burning question is, do you guys think that we're at all likely to see a lot of folks back down a bit from the harshness of the rhetoric that we've seen in American politics recently?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, obstruct and resist is one thing. Like I said, it obviously doesn't imply violence, but it still does kind of imply that this is the end of the world. When Trump won the election, right, for the first couple of days, or even the first couple of weeks, it was, you know, a very interesting time. We didn't really know what was going to happen. We didn't know what kind of people he was going to look for advice, who he was going to nominate for his cabinet. You know, eventually we realized that, you know, even though it was a semi-normal cabinet, you know, it wasn't like Sarah Palin or Sheriff Clark was coming in or anything like that, which was good. And we realized that this isn't going to be the end of the world. Probably not going to start a nuclear war or anything like that. So, you know, we're remembering that this is not the end of the world, that, you know, we're going to see some changes in, you know, our the healthcare industry, and, you know, there's going to be changes to tax reform and free trade and things like that. Nothing there is going to be the end of the world, and thankfully that's because we have a constitutional republic where things go through Congress instead of just, you know, some kind of prime ministership or dictatorship where things can change rapidly depending on who's in office. So just remember that the government is designed to move slowly, and thankfully nothing I don't think anyone is going to do is going to be the end of the world.
Mm-hmm. And you, Charles?
Well, I hope you're right about that with the Trump administration. I'm a lot less confident than you are about that. But to go to the broader question, I really would be actually very surprised if this did cause a lot of people to dial down their rhetoric, because unfortunately, I mean, this is very lamentable, but while the overall murder rate has nosedived, mass shootings have become a fairly standard occurrence. And they're horrifying, but they're not unusual. And so it's hard for me to imagine that if other mass shootings that we've had have not caused people to dial back their rhetoric, I don't really see rhetoric getting dialed back now. I think that very heated rhetoric and ad hominem attacks, rightly or wrongly, have become and really have always been a fairly standard feature of American politics. If they do end up changing, I don't think it's going to be anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I understand just your pessimism there, and ultimately we'll have to wait and see. The reason I asked that question is because I read in the Washington Post that apparently the rocker Ted Nugent, who has spewed some vile rhetoric against President Obama in the past, for example, talking about Obama should suck his machine gun, and I think in 2008 he said if Obama won the election, by this time next year I will be either in jail or dead, that kind of stuff. Now Ted Nugent is saying he is going to back down from using a lot of that overheated and often hateful and even violent rhetoric. So, it remains to be seen whether even he alone will actually make good on that pledge. Fingers crossed. Just to wrap things up, why don't I give each of you the opportunity to make sort of a little closing statement, and then we can break. How about you, Charles?
Go ahead, Charles.
Okay, so I would encourage everyone in most circumstances. I've sort of laid out what I think the exceptions are, but I would encourage everyone in most circumstances not to assume bad intentions just because somebody disagrees with you on an issue like gun control or healthcare or foreign policy. I would also say, though, that I think we also have to accept that a part of our political discourse is going to be heated arguments and also nonviolent. I stress nonviolent resistance to unjust government policies. Sometimes there are going to be violent nut jobs who take some of the things that they've heard and run with it and end up doing things that most of the people that they've been listening to, most of the politicians and most of the pundits would never advocate or condone. Again, unless somebody is actually promoting blatant bigotry and it helps motivate somebody to commit a hate crime, except in circumstances like that, I don't think we can hold people's heated rhetoric responsible for other people snapping and acting violently. So that's kind of my closing statement.
Yeah, and just to kind of respond to what Akil was saying earlier about, if someone is uncivil to you, then you have the right to be uncivil back. Yeah, I do think you have the right to be uncivil back, at least with your rhetoric. Again, that doesn't mean you should necessarily. Sometimes, you think about what someone does to you and it's bad. Sometimes it's better to, just show them even more kindness and love in return than you would have in the first place. Not that you have to, but just an option. The option is there. And again, I think that's important to stress that only applies with rhetoric. If someone on the other side is violent, that does not at all ever give you the right to be violent in return, whether that's just, a simple shove or for anything from that to, shooting members of Congress on the other side. That's never okay. That's never allowed. And hopefully we can, remember that members of Congress, are generally responding to their constituents when they have their beliefs. But don't assume the worst of them either. Just remember that they are doing their best job that they can generally to represent their constituents and the people that they elected them in office. That's all I got.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining me, you guys. Frankly, I actually plan to continue this whole discussion with other guests in the days and weeks to come, and maybe even just do it regularly, like maybe once a month or once a season. Just, go over the state of political discourse in America to see if things actually do get any better at all. Again, fingers crossed. And of course, I'm sure I'll be getting both of you guys in on those discussions, as well as a number of others in the months and years to come. Thanks so much for joining me, guys.
Thank you.
I look forward to more discussions.
Yes, indeed.